Good day to the students in historiography. It's been a while since I've made one of these videos this past spring, so I've had to kind of review the process. This lecture is about research methodology in history. Historiography includes studying how history is written, the kind of research methods and citation and things like that, proper use of sources. It also includes the study of various schools of interpretation of history that we'll be getting into some later. As you go along with this lecture, you do need to, it will help you a great deal if you have the handout that I put on, it's under handouts on the MyUJ on finding a topic and developing a thesis. um, One of the things you need to do as you begin thinking about a topic in a history class is consider what your assignment asks you to do. Now, that may sound too simple. You might think, well, how can anybody not know what they're supposed to do? Well, you would be surprised. I had a student several years ago in a summer class. The assignment was a research paper. This student turned in a PowerPoint presentation that was fairly well done, but it wasn't what had been assigned. In this particular course, you do need to know, you do need to pay some attention to exactly what is required, because your paper cannot be just a general history paper about an event or a person, unless you can do a paper on a prominent historian, talk about their life, their career, what historical works they were known for, if they identified or kind of created a particular school of history. You can also look at a prominent historical site with how it's been preserved and how it's been interpreted, or you can write on some particular aspect of public history, such as how can a person get a job in public history, what kinds of things are done in public history, and things like that. So make sure that your paper deals with one of those three options. Now, formulating a thesis is very important. Once you have your thesis, it focuses your research. If you don't know exactly what you're doing as you start out, you may end up taking an awful lot of notes that you really won't ever need. Um, the problem, of course, is you have to do some research before you can come up with the basic thesis. One thing is make sure any preconceptions they have about the subject are supported by evidence. You may want to write a paper about something that you think you know, but you don't know very much. When I was in graduate school, I did a research paper on Alexander Campbell, one of the founders of the Disciples movement, Disciples of Christ, American religious denomination. I did a paper on his views of slavery, and I knew later in his life, when he was publishing a journal, he was pretty much anti-slavery, maybe not an abolitionist, but anti-slavery. But I was surprised when I got into the research for that paper to find that he had owned slaves at one time. He and his father were both very much against slavery, but he had married into a family that owned slaves, and they had given his wife some slaves. But eventually he sold all of them and got himself out of the position. Well, I wasn't expecting that. You also want to see if sources you would need are readily accessible. On a paper in a history class, you're not going to be traveling to archives somewhere a long way away. When I was doing research for my doctoral dissertation, I was fortunate there were some archives right in Kansas that were very valuable. The Kansas State Historical Society's collections, plus at Ottawa University, a church-related school associated with the Methodists, they had the archives of the conference of the Methodist Church that oversaw the Methodist missions there. But I also had to go to Nashville, Tennessee to work in the Southern Baptist archives, and to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania to work in the archives of the American Baptist or Northern Baptist. But you don't want to get into a situation where you have to do that for a paper on the undergraduate level. After you do some preliminary reading, think about any thesis possibilities you might have in mind. Are these reasonable? Do you think you can make a good case for what you want to assert or argue in your paper? You want to focus on one aspect. You have a topic, but then within that topic, what exactly are you going to say about this? What are you going to investigate about this topic? Now, if you've written papers before, you probably know that it may be necessary to revise or refocus your thesis as you get into your research. Often this is going to mean limiting what you are doing. You've tackled a subject that's too broad. Rather than giving up and picking something else before you do that, that may be necessary, but before you do that, think about ways you can kind of repurpose what you're doing. Can you refocus your thesis or the purpose of your paper to make use of what you have already done? The portion of the handout that talks about developing your thesis is pretty valuable. It suggests that you think of yourself as a member of a jury, but I would say it might be better to think of yourself as the lawyer in a case, one of the lawyers, either the prosecution or the defense. Are you going to make a good argument in your case, in your paper, that would build a convincing argument about your conclusions on the topic? This handout is from the University of Wisconsin. It has a good point there. A thesis is not a question that can be answered yes or no. That is good advice. Remember, that's too simplistic. But a question, a little more involved question, can be a good thesis. Why did Lee decide to order Pickett's charge at Gettysburg? You can look at the evidence. Unfortunately, I don't think you'll find much that Lee himself said about it, but you can look at the evidence and try to come up with a conclusion. Another example, why did people in early America think George Washington was the logical choice for the first president when the Constitution was developed? The handout gives you some good examples of inadequate thesis statement. The thesis of your paper is reasons for the fall of communism in Europe. That's a topic. It's probably much too broad. What are you going to argue are the most significant reasons? That could be a thesis, perhaps. Communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. That's not a thesis. That's just a statement of fact. The fall of communism is the best thing that ever happened to Europe. That's a statement of opinion. We may all agree that that is among the best things, but can you really prove it was the best? Was it better than Overcoming the Black Death, or is it better than defeating Hitler? Now, a better one is the fall of communism in Eastern Europe was brought about by political, social, and economic reasons. That is better, but as it points out in the handout there, the problem with that is virtually any phenomena you might want to study was probably impacted by political, social, and economic reasons. You might be able to pick out one of those and say, while political, social, and economic factors all contributed to this, I am going to argue that this one of those three was the leading reason. In your paper, you should state your thesis clearly. Remember, when you have to read papers or books for a reaction paper or book review, you want the author to say, this is what I'm doing. Well, you should do the same thing then. And again, the handout says a good standard place for your thesis statement is at the end of your introductory paragraph. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be where it is, but there are good reasons why you might want to have it there. Some of you have probably seen that in some essays or books by historians, they may start out by saying, this is what is the standard interpretation of this. This is what other scholars have said about this. And if you're not careful, you may think, okay, that is this person's thesis. But as you read on, they will eventually come to, well, now I'm going to show you why I don't agree with this accepted interpretation. And here is my thesis. You might remember you have done the paper on the Beard essay. Some scholars would argue maybe that you don't find his thesis until the very end almost, where he says the Constitution is essentially an economic document. So not all historians do put the thesis right at the beginning, but it's generally, if you don't do it, you probably better need a very good reason for not doing it. Now, when it comes to citing your sources, in any class, you should expect that you will be required to use the citation methods that are used in that discipline. And in history, that means footnotes or endnotes. The parenthetical style of notation that you use in many of the sciences is not used in history, and you should not use it in this class, or for me anyway, in any of my classes. I don't know what Dr. Weinzierl would say. And when you're in a Dr. Johnson class, unless it's one of the history classes he teaches for us, if it's a political science class, you should use whatever is the accepted form for political science. I have provided guidelines for you on how to do footnotes and endnotes. You should follow these guidelines. And again, you'd be surprised the number of papers I get where I can tell people have never taken a look at my guidelines. Failure to have the notes in the proper fashion will hurt your grade. Failure to have any citations at all, that makes it very easy for me to grade your paper, just F and move on. The book by Mark Gilderhouse and the one that we'll be reading later in this course by Horton and Horton on the slavery and public history, they both use endnotes. And so you can look at these books for examples of how you should be doing notes. Unfortunately, a lot of times in history books, when they put collections of essays together for history students, they don't have the notes, and so the students are not seeing this kind of stuff in action. Now, endnotes and footnotes are essentially the same. You can use either option. Footnotes go at the bottom of your page. Endnotes are at the end of the paper. They're really about equal in the ease of doing them. The only thing with footnotes, if a professor gets very picky about, I don't want a footnote to start on one page and carry over to another, then endnotes become a little easier. But I don't care that much about it. So you can use either footnotes or endnotes. If you look at one of the chapters in either of the books, either Horton and Horton or Gilderhus, you'll note that each note has a unique number. In other words, the first note in the back of the book for that chapter, the first note is numbered 1, and you'll never have another note number 1. I have had people turn in papers where every time they referred to a source, they had the same number on it. I frankly don't even know how they did that, because in Word, when you insert a number, it will when you tell it to insert a note, it will automatically create a new number. So the same number should never appear again. If you want to refer again to material you cited in the first note, you can use IBID, or you can give the author's last name, brief title, and page number. In Word, you create notes by going to the toolbar at the top of the page, click on References. It will then give you the option Insert Footnote or Insert Endnote. I've had students tell me before, well, it will automatically do the APA. So, well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't do anything until you type the note in. Choose whether you want endnote or footnote. It automatically puts the superscript, small font number, in the text where you want your note, and then at the bottom of the page, it has the same number, again, superscript or slightly elevated, where you can type the material for your note. After you have made a first reference to a book, first citation, then you don't have to write all of that over. If a citation follows right after the first note and is to the same source, you can use the Latin abbreviation IBID, which means in the same place. Now, this word should be capitalized, and there should be a period after because it is an abbreviation. Although it is Latin, you don't have to put it in italics as a foreign language because it is so commonly used in English. Now, if you have other notes in between, then when you want to refer back to another source you've already used, you can't use IBID because IBID takes you to the note immediately above the one you're working on now. In those cases, then, what you do is you give the author's last name, a brief portion of the title, and then the page number you're citing. So if you'd cited Gilderhus's book once, then you have some other notes to other books, but you want to go back to Gilderhus. The note has a new number, but you can just put the last name, Gilderhus, and then a brief portion of the title, and then the page number you're citing. You can, if you wish, repeat the whole original note, which is not that hard to do with cut and paste word processing, but it is not necessary. Now, in brief papers, no bibliography is necessary. A bibliography would simply be rewriting the notes in a slightly different form. The reason bibliographies are used in papers that use the parenthetical style of notation is that then the sources are listed alphabetically by the author's last name. But all of the author and book information will be in your note, so you don't have to write a bibliography. Some students seem to think that a list of sources at the end of the paper is sufficient, and then they don't have any notes. that is, again, a good way to fail or maybe pass by the skin of your teeth. For example, if you've got a note to Gilderhouse's, or you don't have a note, but you put Gilderhouse's book in a list of sources, well, how am I supposed to know exactly where in your paper are you dealing with that, and where in Gilderhouse's book are you citing? Am I going to have to read the whole book to find what you're talking about? So make sure you understand the material about how to do notes. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to email me or call me. It might be best to email me and make an appointment for when we can talk on the phone or something like that. But I'm glad to help you with this. But as I said earlier, you would be surprised the number of papers I get, even in classes where most of the papers are being done by history majors, where they pay no attention to this material about how to make your citations. One other thing I want to say about citations, I probably should have created a slide about this, but I didn't. Your citations are not just to guard against plagiarism. It's not just so that I can go and look at what you are citing and make sure you're not copying it word for word and not really saying that you're copying it. It's also so that I can reproduce your process of reasoning. If you've ever seen the movie, Red October, The Hunt for Red October. The Soviet submarine captain, he's questioning this guy that's a CIA analyst that's been put on his boat to figure out what they're doing. And the CIA guy says he wrote a certain book, and the captain says, I know this book. Your conclusions were all wrong. Well, the purpose of your notes is, if I'm reading along in your paper and you say, noted Civil War historian Bruce Catton argued that such and such, and I'm reading along, I think, wait a minute, I've read that book by Catton. I don't think that's what he says. Maybe you're not citing, maybe you're not giving an exact quote. You're just kind of paraphrasing and summarizing what he said. Well, a note can take me right to exactly where you claim you found this material. And then I can look and say, no, it's not there. Either you got a mistake here, you're citing the wrong place, or you misunderstood it. You took something out of context or something like that and made the author say something he or she did not say. Now, in the guidelines that I have given you, there are examples of different types of citations. For most things in this class, you're probably going to be using either books or journal articles, or maybe a citation to a high quality website. Now, for books, here's an example of my book on expansionism, how it would look in a note. Some things to note about this note. First of all, notice the author's name is not turned around. It's not Joy, Mark S. In notes, you're not alphabetizing anything, so you just put the author's name, first name, middle initial, if any, last name. The book title is put in italics, and be sure to include the subtitle, because often that is very important. Notice, for example, in the subtitle to this book, A Manifest Destiny with a question mark. I don't know if any of you have had American West. I don't remember for sure, but I use my book in American West, and I ask them a question about, does the author of this book believe America was destined to expand across the continent? Well, if they would notice the question mark there, then I wouldn't get so many papers that say, oh, yes, he argues that it was destined. I'm not a Calvinist. I don't think anything's really destined. Now, the city where the book is published is given in parentheses with the name of the publisher and the date it was published. And then after the parenthesis, the page number. Now, actually, you can use the P. You can leave the P out if you want. The most recent most recent guides on how to do citations say you don't have to have a page or PP for page number, or for multiple pages, because what else would it be? It would obviously be referring to a page, so you don't need to have the abbreviation. So you can either use it or leave it out. Now, again, if you already had a note to this book in your paper and later you were going to refer to it again, if it was, just right after it, you could use IBID. But if there's other notes intervening, then you want to come back to this book. You would just give last name, a brief part of the title, and the page number. References to materials and journals can be cited as shown below. The author's name, again, you don't turn the name around. Then the title of the article is put in quotation marks. Then the title of the journal is given in italics. And then you have a number, 81 in this case means this is volume 80 of the Journal of American History and issue number 1 of that volume. And then you have the date in parentheses and then the page number. So note that the article, the title is in quotation marks, the title of the journal is in italics. Now, I'm not going to do a great deal with internet sources, and I usually tell my students, whatever you've learned in other classes about how to cite internet sources, I'm probably not going to argue with it. However, I would warn you, do not make heavy use of internet sources without using some critical judgment. I think the internet's been around long enough now that people are getting a little better about this, but people used to think, oh yeah, I found this on the internet. It's got to be the most up-to-date and the best information. Well, no, it may not be. It may be a website created by some crank who has a very iconoclastic view on a particular history subject and wants to get that view out. I have actually had people turn in a paper with a website, and when I look at the website, I found out this website was put together by Mrs. Johnson's sixth grade class. Well, it may be a good website, but you're a college student, you're going to trust them for your information. I think I may have referred to in an earlier Zoom meeting we had. I've also had once in American Religion where students, they did these worship service reports where they would go visit a church and then write about their experience. They were supposed to do some background research beforehand. I've given up using those kind of reports because the students generally didn't do that. But one semester I had a bunch of students who turned in papers where their background research was from atheist.com. And I told them in class, didn't it suggest to you that that might be a biased source? Now, actually, I didn't see anything. I didn't see that the people who wrote those, who wrote basically they were usually kind of a description of a denomination published on their website. I never saw that they were taking any cheap shots. So they weren't all that bad, but I would avoid something like that just because you might assume there could be some bias there. Now, when I say be careful about using internet sources, if you're taking a journal article, something that actually did appear in a published journal, then the fact that you found it on the internet, I don't care about that. You can cite it just as if you had the print version, because usually on most of those databases, you are getting exactly the same thing that was in the print version. Now, when you are referring to websites, and again, not all websites are bad. If you're doing a paper on a historic site, then the website of that historic site might be very valuable. And often, at least in the ones that belong to the National Park Service, they will have some places that it's sometimes kind of hard to find, but they will have links to the interpretive plan that talks about what are we, what teaching are we trying to get across at this site. So those can be very good. But one thing to remember on all websites is we don't know how permanent they are. That's why you usually see the guidelines that tell you how to cite will tell you to list the date that you accessed it, because you may have accessed it today and it was there and perfect, and a month later you turn in your paper, I go to look at it, it's disappeared. So you need to be careful about things like that. Now, I think this is the last slide, so I'm going to wrap up here in a minute, but let me warn you, one thing to always make sure, as I said earlier, make sure you know what your assignment is, but also make sure you understand your topic before you get into it. And I'll give you an example from my own experience, even though it's a little bit embarrassing to me, but I have written a lot of reference articles over the past few years. I make a little bit of money doing that, and I actually kind of enjoy it. But a few years ago, one of the publishers that I work with sent a list of, this was supposed to do kind of a biographical sketch of an author. And so I'm looking through the ones they want articles on, and I come up with this name, Stanley Elkin. And I think, oh, I know Stanley Elkin is a prominent historian of slavery, had some particular views that almost became like a minor school of interpretation about what slavery did to people as far as their psychological makeup and things like that. So it shouldn't be too hard to find material on Stanley Elkin. Well, I ended up writing a pretty good article on Stanley Elkin, but the problem was it's not the guy I thought he was. Stanley Elkins is the historian, an S on his end, on the end of his name. Stanley Elkin was a guy who taught English in a university. He wrote 3 or 4 or maybe 5 novels that were the kind of books that were critics praised them, thought they were very well done, but they never really sold very well. So I ended up, finding out my mistake and finding that there was material available about Stanley Elkin, although it would have been a lot easier to find material on Stanley Elkins. I was fortunate to find a guy who had written a biography of him, and even though his biography wasn't out yet, he was able to answer some questions for me through email. So make sure you know what it is you're proposing to write about before you get too far in it. All right, well, that is all for this assignment. I will be, when I post this, you'll get an email with a link to this, and I probably will also put in that email the quiz that I want you to do and the date that quiz is to be done. And then that way I know that you are at least alleging that you read, that you went through this lecture. So good night and good luck.